Bill Gaither sat down for a conversation that was supposed to be about legacy, and somewhere in the middle of it, he said something that reframes 3 decades of departures from the Gaither vocal band in a single breath. He did not name names aggressively, did not deliver accusations, and did not perform regret for the cameras. What he said was quieter than any of that, and somehow cut deeper. He admitted that he had failed some of these men, not as a music director, not as a business partner, but in the most human way one person can fail another, by not seeing what they were carrying. 6 decades in gospel ministry preceded that admission, and the man who delivered it is not given to dramatic confessions. That is exactly why it lands the way it does, and once you hear it, the stories you thought you understood about Guy Penrod, Michael English, David Phelps, Russ Taff, Mark Lowry, and the others start to look like something entirely different from what they appeared to be at the time. Understanding what that admission means requires going back to what the Gaither vocal band actually was for the people who loved it. Those homecoming videos, the VHS tapes and later DVDs that filled church fellowship halls and living rooms across the country from the early 1990s onward, were not simply recorded concerts. Something else was happening in those rooms, and the millions of Americans who watched those tapes knew it without being able to fully explain it. Bill assembled these singers not primarily for vocal range, though the voices were extraordinary, but because each man carried something an audience could feel. Guy Penrod brought a thunderous baritone that could rattle a gymnasium, and then drop to a whisper that made grown men weep in the same song. David Phelps climbed tenor notes that seemed physically impossible for a human voice to reach, and longtime fans still describe his instrument as the most purely gifted in the history of gospel music. Michael English arrived in 1991, and his debut with the group was one of the most electric moments contemporary Christian music had produced up to that point. Russ Taff walked in already a legend, a man who carried a lifetime of struggle and faith in every syllable he sang. Mark Lowry held the unusual distinction of being genuinely funny and genuinely anointed in the same breath, and co-writing "Mary Did You Know," which became one of the most recorded Christmas songs of the modern era, was only part of what he brought to those rooms. Wes Hampton gave the group a steadiness and warmth that audiences came to depend on. Linda Randall, though not a formal member of the vocal band, remained a constant presence in the homecoming world. Her voice weighted with the kind of joy that only arrives through hardship. For the millions who grew up with those recordings, these were not performers filling a stage. They were ministers. Their voices played in the background of funerals, of hospital rooms, of Sunday mornings when faith felt too heavy to hold alone. And what happened in those rooms was not entertainment. That is the foundation this entire story rests on, and without it, none of what follows carries its proper weight. Through most of the 1990s, the Gaither vocal band operated as the most stable and beloved group gospel music had ever produced. The homecoming recordings sold in numbers that stunned the Christian music industry. The concerts filled venues that left secular promoters paying attention. Bill had built something that felt permanent, not just a ministry, but an institution. And then the voices started leaving, one by one, across 3 decades. The public explanations were always gracious, always carefully measured, and always just slightly incomplete. Michael English left first, and the year was 1994, and what followed was public and devastating. He disclosed the affair himself, returned a GMA Dove Award, and watched a career collapse almost overnight. But what almost no coverage of that moment addressed was the deeper layer. Michael was dealing with addiction, something he has spoken about openly in the years since, and the gospel world of the mid-90s had no framework for a man who was both genuinely anointed and genuinely broken at the same time. What the story consistently missed is what happened after. During Michael's darkest years, Bill reached out quietly, persistently, and without conditions attached, the way a father reaches out to a son who has wandered. Michael returned to the Gaither stage not once, but multiple times in the decades that followed, and each return carried more emotional weight than the last, because restoration is a different thing from a professional arrangement. Watch any footage of those reunion moments, Michael standing beside Bill again with the audience on its feet, and the picture is clear. Bill Gaither was never building a perfect group. He was building a redeemed one. That pattern with Michael became the template for nearly every significant departure that followed. Guy Penrod stepped away in 2008, and the reason he gave was his family, 8 children, and a touring schedule that had grown incompatible with the kind of father he wanted to be. That reason is real, and it is honorable. But Guy has described something deeper running underneath it, a spiritual exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue, going through the motions of ministry without the inner life to sustain it. Those were his words. And for a man whose faith is as central to his public identity as Guy Penrod's is, that kind of honesty asks to be taken seriously. The homecoming era at its peak, roughly 1993 through the early 2000s, produced recordings that looked effortless on the finished tapes. Behind them were marathon sessions that gathered dozens of artists in a single location for days at a time. Singers expected to be emotionally present, spiritually open, and personally available in ways that most professional environments never demand. When those sessions ended, the road resumed. Tour buses and hotel rooms in cities that blurred together. Guy once described arriving home after a long stretch of touring and standing in his own kitchen feeling like a stranger, with his children growing up in chapters he had missed, and Angie managing the household alone, with grace, but under genuine weight. Leaving the vocal band in 2008 was one of the hardest decisions of his life, and by his own account, one of the most necessary. He was not walking away from ministry. He was moving toward his family before the distance became something that could not be crossed. What Bill has only recently begun to acknowledge openly is that the system itself made these breaking points nearly inevitable. Building a ministry on the gifts of human beings, asking those human beings to pour themselves out year after year without adequate space for rest or honest conversation about struggle, that structure carries its own costs, however unintentional. David Phelps left and returned and left again, a pattern that genuinely confused fans who could not understand why someone with that voice would walk away from the platform Bill provided. The answer lived in the tension between his artistic ambitions and the requirements of ensemble singing. Pursuing orchestral projects like Revelation and Life is Good required creative independence that membership in the vocal band made impossible. And stepping away was not a rejection of the Gaither family, but an act of faithfulness to the full scope of what was placed inside him. Bill understood that, and the door stayed open every time, the way a good father keeps the door open for a son who needs to find his own direction for a season. Russ Taff's story carries the most weight of any departure in this account. For years, Russ lived with a secret that came close to destroying him entirely. His struggle with alcoholism, which he and his wife Tori documented in the 2017 film I Still Believe, the Russ Taff story, stayed hidden from nearly everyone in the gospel world for decades, singing about grace while privately drowning in addiction, standing before audiences to minister about the faithfulness of God while his family lived quietly in crisis at home. That was the reality behind the voice people heard from the stage. Bill recorded alongside Russ for years, and has said in reflection that he did not see what was happening. And that admission raises the question this whole story has been building toward. How many of these men were struggling in ways that the culture of professional Christian ministry made it nearly impossible to acknowledge? Russ Taff described a rhythm of life in which there was simply never enough stillness for the truth to surface. Russ was always moving, always singing, always needed somewhere. The genuine spiritual need of the audiences who came to those concerts made it almost impossible for him to stop and say that he was not all right. When 10,000 people have just watched you sing and felt something shift in their souls, the moment for that kind of honesty has already passed. And so the silence held, the drinking continued, and the man on the stage and the man in the hotel room became two separate people sharing one body. The breaking came before the healing, but the healing did come, and it came partly through the same community that had, without knowing it, helped create the conditions that made his silence possible for so long. Mark Lowry's departures from the vocal band, the first coming officially in 2001, have almost always been explained through the lens of his humor and the difficulty of categorizing his presence in a ministry context built around a certain kind of gravity. Mark has leaned into that framing with the easy self-deprecation that has always been his gift. But in longer interviews and in his own ministry settings, he has spoken about a deep loneliness that followed him through most of his life. Growing up in a household where his behavioral struggles, likely what would now be identified as ADHD, created ongoing tension, left a mark that his public warmth does not fully conceal. Bill Gaither made room for him anyway, kept Mark in the vocal band not despite the unpredictability he sometimes brought, but partly because of what that unpredictability revealed about grace. Mark Lowry's presence in the Gaither world functioned as a kind of theological argument, that the table is wider than anyone's comfort zone, that the kingdom has room for the man who makes you laugh until you cry, and then turns around and sings something that makes you cry for an entirely different reason. Hampton, one of the more consistent presences in the Gaither world across the years, once described what Bill creates around him as not a recording environment, but a room where people feel permission to be honest. Building that kind of room is harder than it sounds, and the evidence of it lives not just in the recordings, but in the men who walked away and found their way back. Michael English standing on that stage again. Russ Taff singing about grace with the earned authority of a man who has needed it more desperately than most people ever will. Penrod ministering now with a freedom he says he did not always feel during the years he spent on the road. Bill Gaither holds more accolades than almost any other figure in the history of American Christian music, including Grammy Awards, Dove Awards, and a place in the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Songs he wrote with his wife Gloria, He Touched Me, Because He Lives, The King Is Coming, are woven into the devotional memory of an entire generation of believers. By any external measure, the ministry he built produced extraordinary and sustained fruit across more than half a century. And yet what he seems most interested in examining now, at this stage of his life, is not the fruit, but the conditions, the human cost of what was built, and what those costs meant for the men who gave their voices to the building of it. That kind of honesty is rare in any industry, and in Christian music, where public image and ministry reputation carry enormous weight, It is almost unheard of. It may also be the most important thing Bill Gaither has ever said. Bill is in his 80s now. The homecoming gatherings continue, and the question of who carries this legacy forward stays genuinely open. But for everyone who has followed these singers since the early recordings in Alexandria, Indiana, since the first time a tape made a room go completely quiet when Michael English opened his mouth, one thing has never changed. What happened in those rooms was never just performance. Something more than that was taking place. The men who delivered it were human beings, with private struggles the stage never revealed, who came through those struggles and kept singing, and whose stories, taken together, tell the truest account of what faith actually looks like when ordinary people live it through the hard years.